Welcome to Inside Audit, IIA Belgium's podcast. In 2021, the IIA started with research and benchmarking as input for the revision of the IPPF. 3 years, countless working groups, 1,600 completed surveys, 19,000 specific comments, and 120 pages later, we have reached one of the most important milestones of the profession in the past decades. Since January the 9th, the global internal audit standards are published, and they will become effective 12 months later. Because of the significance of this milestone, we will dedicate 5 episodes of this podcast, one for each domain of the standards, with our 3 distinguished guests. Welcome again, Kathleen, John, and Nicolas, for this 3rd episode about the internal audit standards, about governing the internal audit function. Domain 3 of the standards is indeed about governing the internal audit function. It outlines the requirements the chief audit executives to work closely with the board to establish the internal audit function, position it independently, and oversee its performance. In the public review period, this was the domain where there was the least agreement from the public and maybe even the most comments. And in the proposed version of the standards, the word must was used throughout this chapter. In the final version, there is a lot less must in there. John, is that a bad thing?
Well, I think it's there was no other possibility. I think it was very brave of the IIA to position it as must. But if you are reasonable about it, we cannot describe boards what to do. That's not our role. But I think that is a role that the IIA has in its advocacy efforts, because the obligations for the board to set these conditions right should be in governance codes and in national legislation. I think now it's indeed up to the CAA to get these conditions in place. The state-of-the-art positioning, reporting lines, have a mature internal audit charter, and have a seat at the audit committee table for full meetings, for instance. But at the same time, the audit committee chair, the audit committee and the board, if educated well, should take responsibility for this. And they should create the right environment. And then the question is, if that right environment is not there, and I said it in the last episode as well, get out of there. But at the same time, there is a lot you can do to achieve these circumstances well. And also that starts, in my view, already in your job interview. And I remember it was in 2004 already when I was approached by Robeco, one of the asset managers in the Netherlands. And they had a meeting with the CEO, and they asked some questions about the positioning and what was my role, and whether the foreign entities were part of it as well. And I didn't receive the right answers. So I sent him an email and said, well, this is not the job for me for these reasons. And then he contacted me and said, can you put it in a memo for me? So I did, because I was an IIA volunteer and I wanted to change the world in this. And then 2 months later, he sent me a letter with all the changes they made in their audit committee. And then I got the job, because then it was acceptable. And I think that's really important, that every chief audit executive doesn't run into a job offer just for the money or for the name of the company, but make sure that the circumstances are right.
And indeed, there are less must statements, but I think the must statements are now addressing the chief audit executive's role. So we do not have the must anymore for the board, which makes sense because these are internal audit standards. So I think we have to put the responsibility on the right place, on the right positions there. And it is indeed not freewheeling. It is up to the chief audit executive to be professional, courageous. We discussed it in the previous session, to address these things with their board and senior management, because these must statements that we had in the exposed versions are still there, but are now defined as what we call the essential conditions. So they are still there, but it's now the responsibility of the chief audit executive to address these things with their board.
I'm very pleased with those standards because they have, in my view, put a sharper focus on the role of the board, although maybe not as strictly or strongly as would have liked to see, but at least it's a departure of a change and a positive change from the previous standards to the new one. What I would add to that is, and I would ask a question to the listeners, do you know if your board of your audit committee are knowledgeable and how about the standards? And that's a question I'm asking. I would expect most, hopefully, would be knowledgeable. But I know from experience that there are audit committees that don't know what are in the standards. What are the expectation from the chief audit executive? I'll take a simple example. Chief audit executive must confirm annually its independence. That's the role of the chief audit executive. Does the audit committee know that They should expect that from the CAE. I'm not sure, and I'll give you another practical example. I was once performing an EQA. I was appointed, I do the EQA, but in the appointment process, I didn't meet with the audit committee while they're supposed to be involved. And I told them when the first time I met them during the EQA, ladies and gentlemen of the board, you have to be involved in the selection appointment of your quality assessors. And they didn't know that. So I hope that those new standards, they will draw the attention of the governing bodies, the board, the audit committee, and I think the chief audit executive and the internal audit function as a whole has a big role now to play in bringing those standards to the board, explaining them, and explaining those relationships, which is very nice now in the standards when you have the roles of the board, the roles of the CAE, and the one that are in common, collaboration. So that's my hope for the future for those standards.
Quality is one of the cornerstones of our profession. Chief audit executives must report every year on internal quality assessments. Now, what does that mean in practice?
Maybe let me start first by pointing out a change in the standards. In the past, quality was conceived as mostly being compliant with the standards, in the sense of if you were generally compliant, you were performing work of quality. And now there is a shift where quality is the combination of compliance and performance, which is interesting because those will have to be incorporated in your quality assessment, including your internal ones. So your question was, what does that mean in practice? First of all, the chief audit executive has, in collaboration with the audit committee, the board, depending on your organization, to define a framework, a quality assessment framework, which will include external quality assessment, internal, and the day-to-day supervision. And then, periodically, report to the audit committee. For the internal assessment, it is once a year. I would argue that what has to be in that reporting has to be agreed upon with the audit committee. The reason is the expectation might differ. As a chief audit executive, you might think this is important information to report to the audit committee. They might have a different view. They might want another kind of information. So to me, the first step is having a conversation between the chief audit executive and the audit committee on what should be in that reporting, what kind of metrics matter for one to the other.
And in your opinion, what are the most important metrics?
I will give you a few examples that I would say, and I'm sure that John and Kathleen will have plenty more, but that would very differ from function to function. You have the classical one, for example, your compliance with the standards. That's a good one. Your completion rate with the plan. Did you reach 100% completion rate or 80%? An explanation. But then you have other ones like the percentage of your staff that are certified. That might be an interesting KPI. I remember there was once a former chief audit executive of one of the FED in the US that was telling me that he was reporting the percentage of his staff that were certified and the satisfaction of the auditees. And apparently he had a correlation between the two. The more certified he had, the higher was the satisfaction for the clients. I don't know if that holds for every function, but that was interesting. It could also be your own progress as an internal audit function on your internal quality assessment and external quality assessment. You probably have recommendation. You're not fully compliant. Nobody, I don't think, is. You can always improve yourself. So those are a few that I think would be knowledgeable and valuable for the audit committee.
I think we should not expect too much of board members because an average board member doesn't know enough about what internal audit can bring and can do. And that also has impact on what they expect on metrics. And I've seen them all in my career. And I remember a discussion with one of them on my budget, for instance, because I didn't use my budget. And then I call it that red. And he said, but that's green, right? I said, no, it's red because I didn't have the resources to do my job. And he was thinking red because I was saving money. And that's a little bit the way of thinking of board members, right?
I think it's also important to see that new shift now compared to the exposed version, that it's up to the chief audit executive as well, as you are mentioning, John, that there is probably a lack of knowledge from board members and from audit committee members. So it's not so, let's say, free anymore for the chief audit executive to say, well, they don't know. He or she also has to take the responsibility to develop the key measures that he or she needs to report to the board.
And internal quality assessments bring us to external quality assessments. Kathleen, the frequency of external quality assessment is at least every 5 years. Is that frequent enough?
Well, it was intentionally to keep the frequency on 5 years. The Standards Board did discuss that a lot, and there were some voices raised for having it more frequently. And I think that the conclusion or the solution or maybe the compromise that came out of it was to have it in the considerations as a good practice based on probably the complexity of your organization as well as your risk environment. If you have very significant risks, it might make sense to have a more frequent EQA. Also there, I think it's balancing the practice with raising the bar for the profession. We did see that over the years, historically, the statistics and the surveys showed that the EQA standards was and still is probably the ones where you see the less compliance. So it's also making sure that we do not push people into non-compliance. Because we've heard, like, for instance, for smaller internal audit functions again, and for the public sector ones, mainly probably due to budget constraints, it is difficult to comply with. And also there, I think that the standards, in particular the considerations, do foresee with some practical solutions, like, for instance, these peer reviews, and also the self-assessment with independent validation. As you may recall, in the exposed version, this was only allowed every 10 years, and now it's back to every 5 years. You can use that practice as a full external quality assessment requirement.
I would like to react on it because I think if you look at our audit plan and the risk assessment we do before that, there is no auditable entity that we only audit once every 5 years if it's a material function. And we need to consider internal audit as a material function in the company. So being audited every 5 years is being arrogant in my view. And I think we should do it at least every 3 years, like we do for other divisions. So I think here IIA probably missed a chance to build in that hygiene factor.
What I would also point out is we don't have to forget that we, as internal auditors, are one of the few professions that have that kind of quality framework with our friends from external auditor. If you think about, for example, say second liners, so far to my knowledge, if you are an operation risk manager or compliance officer, you don't have that kind of quality framework with standards that require internal assessment, that require quality assessment. So I do share John's concern, but I think it's a good middle ground that I has struck, given what's happening in other important professions, like second liners or like external auditors.
John, how should we as the IIA ensure that each internal audit function comply with this requirement for the external quality assessment? And if companies don't comply or internal audit departments don't comply, should there be consequences?
Yeah, that's in line with the previous question, a very difficult question, of course. And I think the point that Nicolas made before on educating the boards is really important. We should educate the board that there is an IIA and that there is an IIA that has obligations for the internal audit function, which is to have an external quality assurance review done every 5 years. And that without having that done, the stamp on the front page of the report, this audit was done in conformance with the standards, cannot be used. And I think if we succeed in advocating that much more than we do now, there will be a pull factor coming from the board to have those external quality assurance reviews done. And then probably the budget will be available, so the hurdles will be taken away. But if that is not successful, I think, and I'm raised in the Netherlands where already since 2008, the external quality assurance reviews are mandatory, monitored by the IIA. And if somebody didn't want to do it, or they had major findings which they did not remediate in a decent time frame, we just kick them out of the IIA. And I think if you have a club, if you have a union, if you have anything, and somebody does not obey to the rules, that's the consequence that at the end of the day, after being extremely patient and helpful, should be the consequence. So membership fees should not win it from conformance with the standards.
And there's probably a two-way approach here. It's about pulling and pushing at the same time, I guess. So I would say maybe punishing the ones that are not complying with the EQA requirement and then recognizing the ones that are complying, right?
And that's the stamp on the report, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree.
I remember a previous conversation we had in an earlier episode that in most cases you need a carrot and a stick. So I have the feeling it's the case here as well. Kathleen, domain 3 enhances the focus on the board. Why is the board so important, and what about the role of senior management in a company?
The board is obviously one of the key stakeholders for internal audit. Without the support of the board, you can even wonder why you would have an internal audit function. They are the ones who have to protect the internal audit function, whilst for senior management, it's more they have to act upon your work, right? However, we heard already here in the conversation that we noticed that the knowledge of what is internal audit and what is the role of internal audit with board members and audit committee members is not often sufficient and lacks a bit of knowledge there. So I think that this domain 3 is a very good communication tool. John referred to educating boards and audit committees. Well, I think that this domain 3 is a very good tool that the chief audit executive can use to go into the discussion with the board, to discuss and exchange on mutual expectations there. What does the chief audit executive expect from the board, and what is the board expect, or should the board expect from the internal audit function? And indeed, senior management is also added there. That was not the case in the exposed version. And we did receive quite a lot of comments that this is also a key stakeholder. And I recall that during one of the sessions we organized with stakeholders that one of the auditors said, well, in internal audit, it takes 3 to tango. So I recall that one, and I like that very much, because indeed it's important to have that triangle relation between boards, senior management, and internal audit. So you have to have a good relation of trust between these 3 parties in order to be effective. So I think it's a very good one that we have added senior management there to stimulate that.
Personally, I thought that domain 3 was the most, in my view, important and valuable change to the standards, because I hope it will foster a discussion between internal audit on one side and board audit committee. And also we know that depending on the organization, the notion of board and audit committee and the setup is different. So maybe it will also trigger a discussion on governance and governance frameworks. So to me, that's if I had to pick one, that's the most important domain I'm now looking at.
John, there is a more explicit focus on the increased responsibilities of the board. What if the board or audit committee is not knowledgeable or not interested in things like quality assessment? And I know in the end you can get out, but probably there are a few steps that you can take before you get out of the company.
Yeah, I think we partly discussed that already. If you have a board that's just not knowledgeable enough, you have a problem. And it's not only the chief audit executive that has the problem, but the company has a problem. And what I would do is probably maybe even use the change of internal audit standards, but also certainly use the ESG movement to talk again to the boards, because also ESG is focusing much more on non-financial information and is getting much more deeper into audit work for the external auditor and for the internal auditor. So I would use maybe that momentum to get on their agenda, give them a little bit of training on internal audit, and then also include this part and certainly the external quality assurance review in that, and try to get more insight and awareness from them. And maybe even your external auditor can help, because that's also a party that they listen to originally very good. So maybe he can help, and maybe even the national IIA could help in presenting to your board. But just make it work. And if it doesn't work, I already said it, get out.
And you speak to a lot of internal audits. You speak to board members as well as your role of ECIA president. Or internal auditors aware enough of the momentum and are they ready to grab that the moment?
Many do, but certainly not enough.
Well, they will have to, because these essential conditions need to be discussed now. It's explicitly in the standards that the chief audit executive has to, on a regular basis, discuss these essential conditions with board and senior management, and has to document that. And it will be reviewed as well during your quality assessment, these type of things.
I was in the global board, and then 1 year vice chair professional practices. And in that year, we tried to figure out about external quality assurance reviews. And then we found, and I think you quoted on that only 50% of the members or the internal audit shops are doing this. And then diving a little bit deeper in that and looking at those 50%, that 50% is also not doing the internal reviews well, and is also having other standards not in place. And so it really helps the profession very much if we improve that situation and increase the percentage. But a chief audit executive that doesn't want to comply with the standard is the same audit chief audit executive that doesn't go to the board to educate. So I think IIA, from the other way, the top-down way, should also help in advocating to board members in general.
How do board members look at these external quality assessments?
Board members or audit committee members see that more as a just check compliance thing, that they don't really see the added value of it. And that is something that we also need to do. And that is the role and the responsibility of the internal audit functions to make sure that there is valuable information there that they want to see. And that's...
There are also things in between, like doing the classical review every 5 years, but then in between do maybe the internal audit ambition model and have it validated or something. That's maybe just 1 day work to see whether the essentials indeed are in place.
It's not just about getting your stamp there. It's also about getting information.
Nobody knows about the stamp.
Mm-hmm.
It is already a few years ago, but on the university, I was asked to talk to board members, and it was 8 series of, let's say, 20 board members. So 160 around that. And I always started about who has internal audit. Oh, yeah, I have. Who has an internal control statement? Oh, yeah, I have. And who does that? Well, that's you, yes? No, it's not us. So they don't know what we are doing. They don't know. And also about the stamp. Do you have a stamp on your reports? They don't know about any stamp. So I think the advocacy is just not there. And that's why we are begging for a video for board members.
So in conclusion of this episode around governing the internal audit function, quality is one of the cornerstones of our profession. The frequency of external quality assessments every 5 years, but more frequent checkups in one way or another might be better, and it definitely takes 3 to tango. So thanks a lot, Kathleen, John and Nicolas. And if you want to know more about this topic, you can go to iiabelgium.org or theiia.org to stay tuned for the latest news around this topic. Thank you very much.